Imagine a world where the people who are supposed to guide you and protect you have taken away your most basic rights. Picture a place where the leaders you trust have turned their backs on the very principles they claim to stand for. This is not a dystopian novel. This is the reality of the church in the past, and in many ways it still is today. In the old days, when a new bishop was chosen, the entire community had a say. It was a sacred process where the people's voices mattered. But over time, this right was stripped away. Instead of the people choosing, a small group of canons took control. They would pick someone they liked and then present this person to the people, not for approval, but for adoration. It was a show, a charade, a violation of the very essence of what the church was supposed to be. Leo, a great leader of the church, spoke out against this. He said it was wrong, that it went against the will of God. Cyprian, another respected figure, agreed. He said that the people's consent was essential, that without it the process was not just flawed, but sinful. The church councils, the gatherings of wise leaders, also ruled that this was not the way things should be done. They said that if the process was not followed correctly, it should be null and void. But the corruption didn't stop there. The canons, the ones who were supposed to be the guardians of the church, began to abuse their power. They made rules, but they didn't follow them. They chose bishops who were drunkards, fornicators, and gamblers. They even promoted adulterers and panders. The laws were there written down, but they were ignored. The people were supposed to be guided by a simple rule. A bishop must be blameless, able to teach, and not a brawler. But this rule was forgotten, and the church suffered for it. The people had a right to choose their leaders, but they were told that this right was taken away for their own good. They were told that the people were too divided, too full of hatred and party spirit, and that the canons were the only ones who could make the right choice. But this was a lie. The canons were just as corrupt, if not more so. They used the power they had taken to enrich themselves and their friends. When kings and princes saw what was happening, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They started appointing bishops themselves, thinking that they could do a better job than the canons. But this just made things worse. Now, bishops were chosen not because they were good or wise, but because they were loyal to the king, or had the right connections. The church was being used as a tool for political power, and the people were left with no say at all. The ordination of priests and deacons, the process of choosing who would lead the church, was also corrupted. Instead of being chosen to guide and feed the people, they were chosen to perform ceremonies and rituals. The church was supposed to be a place of service, but it had become a place of empty shows and meaningless traditions. The canons would ordain people without giving them a specific place to serve, and these people would just collect money without doing any real work. The church was supposed to be a light in the darkness, a place where the poor and the needy could find help and comfort. But it had become a place of greed and corruption. The people were being robbed of their right to choose, and the church was being robbed of its true purpose. This is the story of how the church lost its way and how it continues to struggle to find it again. In the world of the church, there are many people who hold important positions, but not all of them do the work they are supposed to. Some of these people are called beneficiaries, which means they have jobs that provide them with a living, like bishops and priests who are in charge of parishes. Others are like day laborers, moving from place to place to perform services like saying masses for money. These day laborers often have to beg or pester people to get enough to eat, which is not a dignified way for a priest to live. The church is supposed to be a place where priests or presbyters teach the Word of God take care of the spiritual well-being of the people, and perform important rituals like the Eucharist. But many of these so-called priests today don't do any of these things. They just chant and perform ceremonies, which is not what the job of a priest is supposed to be. They don't teach, they don't take care of people, and they don't even have a community to lead. They just have an altar where they perform the Eucharist. But this is not the same as leading a community in worship and teaching. Some people might say that these priests have always been this way, but that's not true. In the early church, priests were supposed to be leaders who taught, cared for the community, and administered the sacraments. If these modern priests can't or won't do those things, they shouldn't be called priests at all. They are just holding onto a title without doing the actual work. Even the people who are supposed to be in charge, like bishops and the rectors of parishes, often don't do their jobs. They might have the title, but they don't actually visit the churches they are supposed to lead. Some of them just collect the money from the church and never even go there. It's like having a farmer who never goes to the farm, or a lawyer who never reads a book. It doesn't make sense, and it's not fair to the people who need their help. This problem didn't just start recently. Even in the time of Gregory, a famous church leader from long ago, he noticed that priests were becoming lazy and not doing their jobs properly. He was very upset about it and said that priests were taking the job but not doing the work. If he saw how things are today, where many priests don't even preach a single sermon in their entire lives, he would be even more upset. The situation got even worse in the time of Bernard, another important church leader. He was very critical of the priests and bishops of his time, and we can imagine that he would be even more critical of the way things are now. The whole system of church leadership in the papacy has become a mess. It's so different from what Christ and the early church leaders intended that it's almost unrecognizable. These so-called leaders in the church often claim to be the pillars of the church, the priests of religion, and the representatives of Christ. But when you look at what they actually do, it's clear that they have nothing in common with the apostles or the early church leaders. The apostles were all about teaching, leading, and caring for the community. These modern leaders are more interested in power, luxury, and living a comfortable life. When it comes to their behavior, the modern clergy are often known for their luxury, laziness, and dishonesty. They are not the kind of people who should be leading the church. If the ancient rules for church discipline were still in place, most of these leaders would be kicked out of their positions. The discipline that used to keep the clergy in line has completely disappeared, and now almost anything goes. Even the deacons, who are supposed to help the poor and manage the church's resources, are not doing their job. In the early church, deacons were responsible for collecting and distributing alms to the poor. Now they just perform some minor roles in the Mass, and the money that should go to the poor is often kept by the bishops and other leaders. This is not what the early church intended, and it's a form of theft and sacrilege. The church's resources, which were meant to help the poor and support the community, have been taken over by the bishops and other leaders. They have divided up the wealth among themselves, and the poor get nothing. This is completely opposite to what the early church taught, and it's a disgrace to the name of Christ. If these leaders had any fear of God, they would be ashamed of how they are living off the church's wealth, which should be used to help others. But they are not moved by this, and they should at least consider how their actions look to the people who see through their claims of being good leaders. The whole system of church leadership in the papacy is broken, and it needs to be fixed. The church should return to the principles and practices of the early church, where leaders were expected to teach, lead, and care for the community, not just hold on to titles and live in luxury. The debate over the primacy of the Roman See is a crucial one, as it forms the foundation of the papal claim to be the head of the Church. The papists argue that the unity of the Church is maintained only through submission to the Roman See, which they believe is the direct successor of St. Peter. However, this claim needs to be examined closely to see if it holds up to the teachings of Christ and the practices of the early Church. The papists often point to the Old Testament, where God appointed a high priest and a central place of worship in Jerusalem. They argue that, just as the Jews had a high priest, the Church should have a supreme bishop, and that this bishop should be the Pope in Rome. However, this argument doesn't hold water for a few reasons. First, the Jewish high priesthood was a temporary institution, specific to the nation of Israel. The Jews were surrounded by idolaters, so God centralized worship to keep them united in the true faith. But now, with the spread of Christianity across the globe, it's absurd to think that one person should govern the entire church. It's like saying the whole world should be ruled by one prefect, just because one city had one. Second, the high priest in the Old Testament was a type of Christ. When Christ came, the priesthood was transferred to him. Christ is the only high priest, and he has no vicar or successor. The role of the high priest was to make sacrifices for the sins of the people, but Christ's sacrifice on the cross was the final one. Therefore, the Pope cannot claim this role. In the New Testament, the papists often cite Jesus' words to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, and "feed my lambs," John chapter 21, verse 15. They argue that these words give Peter, and by extension the Pope, authority over the entire church. However, this interpretation is flawed. When Jesus told Peter to feed his sheep, he was giving a command to all the apostles, not just Peter. In fact, Peter himself, in his letter, exhorts all elders to shepherd the flock of God. 1 Peter 5:2. This shows that the responsibility to care for the church was shared among all the apostles, not concentrated in one person. Furthermore, the power to bind and loose, which Jesus gave to Peter, was also given to all the apostles. In John chapter 20, verse 23, Jesus says, "Whosoever sins ye remit, they are remitted unto them, and whosoever sins ye retain, they are retained." This means that the apostles, and by extension the church, have the authority to forgive or retain sins. This power is not limited to one person. The early church fathers, such as Cyprian and Augustine, also provide insights that contradict the papal claim. Cyprian, for example, emphasized the equality of bishops and the importance of collegiality in the church. He argued that the church is a body with many members, and no single bishop should have dominion over the others. Augustine, too, stressed that Christ is the head of the church, and that all believers are united in him, not in a human leader. The idea that the church needs a single earthly head to maintain unity is also problematic. The early church respected the See of Rome, but not because it was seen as the supreme authority. Instead, it was respected because of its association with the apostles Peter and Paul, who were believed to have been martyred there. However, this respect did not mean that the Bishop of Rome had universal authority over the church. In the end, the arguments for the primacy of the Roman See do not stand up to scrutiny. The early church did not operate under a hierarchical system with a single supreme bishop. Instead, it functioned as a community of believers, united in Christ and guided by the Holy Spirit. The true head of the church is Christ himself, and he alone should be the focus of our faith and obedience. The debate about Peter and the keys of the kingdom of heaven has been a long and heated one. Some people believe that when Jesus told Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven," Matthew chapter 16, verse 19, he was giving Peter a special power over the church. But others argue that this was a metaphor for the apostolic duty of preaching the gospel and teaching the faith, which all the apostles shared. When Jesus talks about the keys, he's using a metaphor. In those days, keys were a symbol of authority. If you had the keys to a house, you had the power to let people in or keep them out. So, when Jesus gives Peter the keys, he's saying that Peter will have the authority to teach and guide people in the faith. But this doesn't mean Peter had more power than the other apostles. Jesus gave the same authority to all of them. In fact, in John chapter 20, verse 21-23, Jesus says to all the apostles, "As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven." The idea that Peter was given a special, unique power that the other apostles didn't have doesn't hold up when you look at the whole of the Bible. For example, in Acts 15, when the apostles and elders gather to decide whether Gentiles need to follow Jewish laws, Peter speaks, but so do the others. James, another leader, makes the final decision, and the whole group agrees. This shows that while Peter was respected, he wasn't the only one with authority. Some people argue that Peter was the rock on which Jesus built his church, and that this means Peter was the first pope. But when you look at what Jesus actually said, it's clear that the rock he's talking about is Peter's confession of faith. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. This confession is the foundation of the church, not Peter himself. Paul even says in 1 Corinthians 3:11, "For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ." Even if Peter did have a special role among the apostles, it doesn't mean that the Bishop of Rome automatically has the same role today. The Bible doesn't say anything about Peter being the Bishop of Rome, or that the Bishop of Rome should have a special authority over the entire church. The idea that the Bishop of Rome is the successor to Peter and the head of the church is something that developed much later. In the early church, there were many important leaders, and the idea of one person having supreme authority over all Christians wasn't common. Paul, for example, was an apostle who was just as important as Peter, and he didn't recognize Peter as his superior. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, Paul even says that he had to correct Peter when Peter was not acting in line with the gospel. So, while Peter was a key figure in the early church, the idea that he was the first pope and that the Bishop of Rome is his successor is not supported by the Bible. The church is built on the foundation of Jesus Christ, and all believers are called to follow him and share the message of the gospel. The idea that the Church of Rome should have the highest authority in the Christian world is a big topic in history. Some people, especially those who support the Pope, say that this idea goes all the way back to the early days of the church. They argue that because the Apostle Peter, one of Jesus' closest followers, supposedly founded the church in Rome, it should be the most important church. But is this really true? Let's look at what some early Christian writers thought about this. One of them, Jerome, wrote a letter to someone named Nepotian. In it, he talks about how every church and every bishop should work together. He doesn't mention anything about one church, like Rome, being in charge of all the others. If that was such an important idea, you'd think he would have said something about it. Instead, he talks about how all bishops are part of one big church, and how they should all work together under Christ, who is the true head of the church. Another early writer, Cyprian, had a beautiful way of describing the church. He said that the church is like the sun with many rays of light, or like a tree with many branches, or like a river with many streams. Each part is important, but they all come from the same source, which is Christ. This means that no one church or bishop is more important than the others. They are all equal parts of the same body. But what about the idea that the church in Rome was special because it was founded by Peter? Well, there are a few problems with this. First, not everyone agrees that Peter even lived in Rome. Some historians say he might have, but others say there's no clear proof. Even if he did live there, it doesn't automatically mean that the church in Rome should be in charge of all the others. After all, Peter was one of many apostles, and other apostles founded other important churches, like the one in Antioch. Another problem is that the early church didn't always treat the church in Rome as the most important. For example, when Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, he didn't mention Peter at all, even though he usually greeted all the important people in a church. If Peter was such a big deal in Rome, you'd think Paul would have said something about him. The early church also had a different way of dealing with problems. If there was a dispute, they would often call a council where bishops from different areas would come together and discuss the issue. The Bishop of Rome might be part of this, but he wasn't always the one in charge. Sometimes other bishops were chosen to lead these councils. So while the church in Rome was respected and had some influence, it wasn't the supreme authority that some people claim it was. The early church believed that all the bishops and all the churches should work together with Christ as their true leader. This idea of unity and equality is very different from the idea of one church having all the power. Over time, things changed, and the church in Rome started to claim more authority. But this wasn't how things were in the early days. The early church had a different understanding of how they should work together, one that emphasized cooperation and equality rather than one church being in charge of all the others. The history of the Roman See and its claims to primacy in the church is a complex and often contentious story. Let's dive into the key moments and figures that shaped this narrative. During the early days of the church, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was a significant event. This council assigned the Bishop of Rome the first place among the patriarchs, but it did not make him the head of all the church. Instead, it set limits for each patriarch, including the Bishop of Rome. For example, when Julius, the Bishop of Rome, sent his representatives to the council, they were given the fourth place. If Julius had been seen as the head of the church, his representatives would have been given the first place. This shows that the Roman See did not have the authority it later claimed. In the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, the Bishop of Rome, Celestinus, used a clever strategy to enhance the prestige of his see. He appointed Cyril of Alexandria as his substitute, ensuring that his name would be linked to the first see. However, at the Second Council of Ephesus in 449 AD, the Patriarch Dioscorus of Alexandria presided, even though Leo's deputies were present. This indicates that the Roman See did not automatically have the right to the first place. The Council of Chalcedony in 451 AD is another important event. The emperor granted the Roman See the first place, but Leo himself admitted this was a special privilege, not a permanent right. Leo's successor also showed this by not insisting on the first place at the Fifth Council of Constantinople. This demonstrates that the Roman See did not always demand the first place. The title primate and other grand titles that the Roman See later claimed were not used in the early church. Cyprian, a prominent early church father, addressed the Bishop of Rome as a brother and equal. The Council of Carthage even forbade the use of titles, like Chief of the Priests or First Bishop. Jerome, a Roman presbyter, also emphasized that the bishop's role was the same, regardless of the city they served in. The controversy over the title Universal Bishop arose during the time of Gregory, the Bishop of Rome, due to the ambition of John of Constantinople. Gregory strongly opposed this title, calling it profane and a forerunner of Antichrist. He argued that if one bishop claimed this title, it would undermine the unity of the Church. Gregory also claimed that this title was offered to Leo at the Council of Chalcedony, but this is not supported by the Council's records. Leo himself would have mentioned this if it were true, as it would have been a strong argument in his favor. The Roman See gradually gained influence through various means. When the Church faced persecution and division, especially during the time of Athanasius, the Bishop of Rome, Julius, supported Athanasius. This helped the Roman See gain respect and influence. However, this influence was often misused. For example, when Eutyches was condemned for heresy, he appealed to Leo, who supported him, leading to further confusion and heresy. The African Church also faced issues with appeals to Rome. Dishonest individuals would appeal to Rome to escape just judgments, leading the African bishops to decree that no one should appeal beyond their own region. The power of the Roman See in ordaining bishops, appointing councils, and deciding controversies was initially limited to their own patriarchate. This shows that the Roman See did not have the universal authority it later claimed. These events and decisions reveal the gradual and often contentious rise of the Roman See's claims to primacy. The early church fathers and councils did not grant the Roman See the absolute authority it later demanded. The Roman See, or the leadership of the Bishop of Rome, has a long and complex history. To understand its authority, we need to look at the different aspects of power it claimed over other churches. First, let's talk about the ordination of bishops. In the early days of the Church, bishops were usually ordained by their own metropolitans, who were like regional leaders. The Roman bishop didn't have the right to ordain bishops outside his own area, which was called a patriarchate. For example, when a new bishop was chosen for Milan, the Roman bishop would send a representative to witness the ordination, but not to lead it. This shows that the Roman bishop was seen as an equal, not a superior. Next, there were the councils, which were meetings where church leaders discussed important matters. Each metropolitan was responsible for calling these councils in their own region. The Roman bishop didn't have the right to call a council outside his own area. Only the emperor could call a universal council that involved all the churches. This shows that the Roman bishop's power was limited to his own region. When it came to censuring or rebuking other bishops, the Roman bishop could do this, but he could also be rebuked in return. For example, Irenaeus, a famous early church leader, once sharply criticized Victor, the Roman bishop, for causing a schism over a minor issue. Victor accepted the criticism without arguing. This shows that the Roman bishop was not above the law and could be held accountable by his peers. The Roman bishop also had the right to hear appeals, but this was not a universal right. When a dispute arose in Africa, the Roman bishop tried to involve himself, but the African bishops resisted. They even went as far as to excommunicate those who appealed to Rome. This shows that the Roman bishop's authority was not universally accepted. One of the most significant examples of the Roman bishop's limited power is the case of Caecilianus, the bishop of Carthage. He was accused by Donatus of Casa Nigra and was condemned without a fair trial. The case was then brought to Emperor Constantine, who decided to have it resolved by a group of bishops, including the Roman bishop Melciades. If the Roman bishop had supreme authority, why would Constantine have appointed other bishops to help decide the case? Moreover, when Donatus appealed the decision, Constantine assigned the Bishop of Arles to handle the appeal. This shows that the Roman bishop's authority was not absolute and could be overridden by the emperor. In the time of Gregory, the Roman bishop's influence grew because of the many problems the empire was facing. Gregory was known for his efforts to maintain the integrity of the faith during these turbulent times. He often helped other bishops and even claimed the right to correct them if they were in the wrong. However, he was careful to respect the rights of other bishops and only intervened when necessary. Gregory himself said, "I do not, under the stimulus of ambition, derogate from any man's right, but desire to honor my brethren in all things." This shows that even when the Roman bishop's power increased, it was still limited and based on mutual respect and cooperation. In the end, the history of the Roman See shows that its authority was not as absolute or uncontested as some claim. The Roman bishop had some influence, but it was always within the context of the broader church and the authority of the emperor. The Roman bishop was seen as a leader among equals, not a supreme ruler over all the churches. The story of the Roman bishop, or pope, is a long and complex one. In the early days, the pope's role was more about helping other bishops and dealing with difficult situations that required special attention. For example, Pope Gregory, who lived around the 6th century, didn't want to interfere with other bishops or take on too much power. He even said he was ready to be corrected by anyone, showing that he saw himself as equal to his fellow bishops. However, as time went on, the power of the Pope grew. The city of Rome was the capital of the empire, which gave the Pope a lot of influence. When the capital moved to Constantinople, the Bishop of Constantinople started to claim he should be the second most important bishop after the Pope. This led to a lot of arguments. Pope Leo, for instance, was very upset when a council decided to give the Bishop of Constantinople a higher rank. He thought this was a threat to his own power and status. The situation got even more complicated when a man named Phocas became emperor. He was friendly with the Romans and gave the Pope the title of head of all the churches. This made the Pope even more powerful, but it also caused problems. For example, when Pepin and Charlemagne became kings in France, they made deals with the Pope to gain support. In return, the Pope gained control over the churches in France. By the time of Bernard, a famous monk who lived in the 12th century, the church in Rome was in a terrible state. Bernard wrote that the church was full of corrupt and ambitious people who were more interested in power and money than in helping the faithful. He was very upset about the way the Pope and his officials were running things, and he warned that the church was losing its way. Today, the Pope claims to have a lot of power over the entire church. He says he can make decisions about doctrine, laws, and discipline, and that no one can question his authority. This is very different from the early days when the Pope was just one bishop among many, helping out when needed. The story of the Pope's rise to power is a reminder that the way things are now isn't the way they've always been. It's important to understand this history, to see how the Church has changed over time, and to think about what it means for the future.